The morning sun hit the freshly cut grass as David walked to his mailbox. But something was wrong. It started as a feeling a subtle shift in the air, like the quiet before a storm. The neighborhood looked the same. The houses stood in their familiar rows. The birds sang their morning songs. But as David stepped onto his lawn, coffee mug in hand, his eyes locked onto something that made his blood run cold. The wooden fence was gone. For 15 years, that fence had marked the boundary of his property. 15 years of mowing up to that line. 15 years of knowing exactly where his land ended and his neighbors began. Now, nothing remained but torn earth and scattered wood chips. In its place stood new stakes, driven hard into the ground, connected by bright orange Surveyor tape that cut like a wound across his backyard. The tape didn't follow the old line. It cut 3 feet deeper into his property, claiming ground that had always been his. David's eyes followed that orange line to the corner of his yard, and his heart stopped. The oak tree, that massive, beautiful oak, had been there when he bought the house. His children had grown up under its branches. They'd hung a tire swing from its strongest limb. They'd carved their initials in its bark. They'd celebrated birthdays in its shade. It was more than a tree, it was a monument to 15 years of family memories. And now, according to those stakes and that tape, it sat on her side of the line. David slowly turned his head toward the neighboring house. Mrs. Patterson stood on her porch watching him. She wasn't confused. She wasn't concerned. She wore a satisfied smile, arms crossed, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. In that instant, David understood. This wasn't a surveyor's error. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was calculated. This was deliberate. Someone had planned this. Someone had waited. And someone had just stolen 3 feet of his land, his tree, and his peace of mind. The morning sun suddenly felt cold. The quiet street felt hostile. And David knew, with absolute certainty, that nothing would ever be the same again. David didn't scream. He didn't confront Mrs. Patterson. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. He needed evidence. He needed proof. He started photographing everything. The new stakes driven into the soft earth. The torn-up ground where the old fence posts used to be. The bright orange tape fluttering in the wind. He zoomed in on the details, capturing every inch of the intrusion. Each click of the camera felt like a small act of rebellion against the injustice unfolding before him. Then, he walked to his gate. That's where he saw it. A bright yellow notice taped to the metal bars. An HOA violation notice. It claimed he had violated setback requirements. It claimed his fence was encroaching on Mrs. Patterson's property. David's jaw tightened. He knew better. He had the original survey from when he bought the house 15 years ago. The lines were clear. The boundaries were fixed. But the notice said the HOA board had already approved her request to move the boundary. They had done it without notifying him, without giving him a chance to speak. Behind his back, while he was at work, they had redrawn his world. He walked back to the mailbox, the one he was heading to when this nightmare began. Inside, 3 letters sat waiting. Each one bore the HOA's official seal. Each one demanded the same thing: remove the fence within 30 days. But the threat was what chilled him. If he didn't comply, they would remove it themselves. And they would bill him for the costs, plus $500 daily fines, starting immediately. $1,500 a day if he waited too long. $500 every single day. It was a pressure tactic designed to break him quickly. They wanted him tired. They wanted him broke. They wanted him to give up before he even found a lawyer. David stood there, letters in hand, looking at his backyard. This wasn't just a dispute. It was a trap. They had bypassed the rules. They had ignored the records. And now, they were using fines and threats to force him out of his own land. He pocketed the letters. He saved the photos. He knew this wasn't over. But as he looked at the numbers on those fines, he realized something. They weren't expecting him to fight. They were expecting him to pay. They were betting on his fear. And David wasn't going to pay for something that was already his. Not 1 cent. Thursday night arrived heavy with humidity and tension. The HOA meeting was held in the community center, a sterile room with fluorescent lights that hummed annoyingly overhead. The air conditioning was too cold, chilling the skin, matching the reception David knew he was about to receive. He walked in carrying a folder thick with documents. His original survey, deed copies, photos of the property line, historical maps. He felt prepared. He felt righteous. He believed in the system. He believed that if he just showed them the truth, they would fix it. He believed justice was blind. He was wrong. The room was packed, but the energy was off. Neighbors whispered, in corners, avoiding eye contact. Mrs. Patterson sat in the front row. She wasn't alone. Beside her sat a man in a sharp suit, her lawyer. They whispered to each other, occasionally glancing at David with cold amusement. They looked like predators who had already caught their prey. They knew something David didn't. The board chairman called the meeting to order. He was a large man with a voice that demanded obedience. He barely looked at David. When it was David's turn to speak, he stood up. His hands shook slightly. He laid out the facts. He showed the original survey from 15 years ago. He explained that the boundary hadn't changed. He spoke about the oak tree, about his children. But the chairman interrupted him. He waved a hand dismissively. He called David's objections emotional. He said the board had to consider the community standards and aesthetics. He reduced David's home to a zoning violation. Then, Mrs. Patterson's lawyer stood up. He spoke smoothly, using words designed to confuse. He claimed adverse possession laws favored his client. He argued that because Mrs. Patterson had maintained that strip of land for 2 years, it now belonged to her. David wanted to shout. She had only moved in 18 months ago. How could she claim 2 years of maintenance? It was mathematically impossible. But the microphone was muted. The rules said only recognized speakers could address the board. His voice was literally turned off. The vote wasn't a debate. It was a formality. David could see it in their eyes. The decision had been made before he even walked through the door. Perhaps over dinner. Perhaps on a golf course. The board members didn't look at their papers. They looked at each other, nodded, and raised their hands. Unanimous. The verdict was delivered coldly. The fence had to come down. If David didn't remove it within 30 days, the Hoa would send a crew to tear it out themselves. And here was the kicker. They would bill him for the labor. They would add the cost to his Hoa fees. If he resisted, the fines would stack. $500 a day. David sat back down. The folder in front of him felt useless. The documents meant nothing here. This wasn't about property lines. This was about power. They had the authority, the lawyer, and the numbers. He had the truth. But in that room, the truth didn't matter. He walked out into the night air, the hum of the fluorescent lights still ringing in his ears. He had lost a battle. But as he drove home in silence, a new thought began to form. If they were willing to lie this openly, what else were they hiding? And how far would they go to keep the lie alive? The drive home was suffocating. The car engine hummed a low, steady note, but the silence inside the cabin was louder than any noise. David gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the black leather. The sound of the gavel banging down still echoed in his mind. Thud. Final. Unchangeable. They had lost. Officially. Legally. Or so they said. He pulled into the driveway. The house was dark, except for the single porch light his wife had left on. She was waiting. When he walked in, she didn't need to ask twice. She saw his face. She saw the defeat in his shoulders. The folder of documents he had carried so proudly was now tucked under his arm like a burden. How did it go? She asked softly, standing in the hallway. David took off his shoes. He couldn't look her in the eye. The shame felt irrational, but it was there. They voted against us, he said. His voice was hollow, lacking any fight. They're forcing us to remove the fence. They're fining us $500 a day. His wife sat down at the kitchen table. She didn't cry. She just looked at him, waiting for what came next. She knew what that tree meant to the family. She knew what this land meant to their future. We should call a lawyer, she suggested, her voice steady. Tomorrow morning, maybe, David said. But something was itching at the back of his mind. A loose thread in the tapestry of lies they had been told. He couldn't let it go. Later that night, the house was quiet. David lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The defeat he felt earlier was fading, replaced by a nagging confusion. A detail from the meeting kept replaying in his head. Mrs. Patterson's Lawyer had claimed adverse possession. He had argued confidently that she had maintained the land for 2 years. That was the legal basis for their claim. Continuous, hostile use for 2 years. David did the math in the dark. Mrs. Patterson had moved into the neighborhood 18 months ago. 1 year and 6 months. How could she maintain land for 2 years if she hadn't even lived there for 2 years? Unless the claim was backdated, or unless someone was lying outright. He couldn't sleep. At 2 in the morning, he got up and went to his home office. He opened the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet. Inside was a manila folder labeled Closing Documents. It smelled of old paper and ink. He pulled out the original property survey from 15 years ago. The paper was slightly yellowed, but the ink was crisp. He laid it on the desk under the lamp. The coordinates were specific: latitude, longitude, meter markers. They were verified with GPS technology at the time of purchase. There was no ambiguity. The property line extended exactly to the center of the oak tree. The tree was his. The land was his. He compared the HOA's map to his original survey. They didn't match. The HOA's map showed a shifted boundary, a subtle slide of ink on paper. But his document was the legal record from the county closing. It was stamped. It was signed. It was valid. Someone had filed false documentation. This wasn't a boundary dispute anymore. Disputes happen when lines are unclear. These lines were clear as day. This was fraud. Someone had altered the records to make it look like Mrs. Patterson had a claim. Someone had lied to the board. Someone had lied to the county recorder. David stared at the paper. The defeat he felt in the car began to evaporate, replaced by a cold, hard anger. They thought he would give up because of the fines. They thought he would accept their version of reality. They bet on his exhaustion, but he held the truth in his hands. And the truth had coordinates. He wasn't just defending his fence anymore. He was uncovering a crime. And now, he knew exactly where to start looking. The morning sun rose again, but the air felt different. Yesterday, it felt heavy with defeat. Today, it felt sharp, like a blade waiting to be used. David sat at his kitchen table, the original survey spread out before him. The coffee was cold, untouched. He had a decision to make. The natural instinct was to call a lawyer, to hire representation, to enter the legal battlefield with words and arguments. But David paused. Lawyers dealt in interpretations. They dealt in gray areas. They argued about what the law said. David didn't need an argument. He needed facts. He needed science. He reached for the old filing cabinet again. He pulled out a faded invoice from 5 years ago. Precision land surveys. He remembered the man who had come to his property then. Careful, methodical. He had used equipment that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Tripods, lasers, receivers. David dialed the number. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was his Hail Mary. If the surveyor couldn't help, the legal fees would bankrupt him before he even started. The phone rang 3 times. A voice answered, professional and awake. David explained the situation. He spoke about the HOA, the new stakes, the threat of fines. He mentioned the adverse possession claim. There was a silence on the other end. Then, a low chuckle. The surveyor remembered. He remembered the property. He remembered the oak tree. Those coordinates weren't guessed, David, the surveyor said. His voice was steady, grounding. We used high-precision GPS technology, sub-centimeter accuracy. There was no dispute then. There shouldn't be one now. Property lines don't move unless someone moves the paperwork. David felt a surge of energy he hadn't felt in days. The HOA says the line moved. They have a new map. They say she maintained the land for 2 years. Maps can be redrawn, the surveyor replied, his tone hardening. But the ground doesn't change. If someone submitted altered documents to the county recorder to match a fake map, that's not a boundary dispute. That's criminal. That's fraud. The word hung in the air. Criminal. Fraud. David looked at the survey on the table. The lines were black ink on white paper, but they represented reality. They represented the earth beneath his feet. Mrs. Patterson hadn't just moved a fence. She had manipulated the system. She had banked on David accepting the HOA's authority without question. She had banked on him being too afraid to verify the science. She thought he would fold under the pressure of fines, but David had verified it. He wasn't just a homeowner fighting a fine anymore. He was a victim of property fraud. The shift in perspective was absolute. The fear evaporated. In its place was a cold, calculated focus. He thanked the surveyor and hung up. He looked at the phone, then at the survey. He didn't need a lawyer to tell him he was right. He needed a surveyor to prove everyone else was wrong. This wasn't about negotiation. You don't negotiate with fraud. You expose it. David stood up. He knew what he had to do next. He had to bring the science back to the soil. He had to make the earth speak for itself. The battle had changed. It was no longer about offense. It was about truth. And for the first time since the orange tape appeared, David knew he was going to win. He looked out the window at the oak tree. It stood silent, waiting. It knew where the line was. And now, so did David. The phone call was over, but the real work was just beginning. He wasn't defending anymore. He was hunting. The morning sun rose again, but the air felt different. Yesterday, it felt heavy with defeat. Today, it felt sharp, like a blade waiting to be used. David sat at his kitchen table. The original survey spread out before him. The coffee was cold, untouched. He had a decision to make. The natural instinct was to call a lawyer, to hire representation, to enter the legal battlefield with words and arguments. But David paused. Lawyers dealt in interpretations. They dealt in gray areas. They argued about what the law said. David didn't need an argument. He needed facts. He needed science. He reached for the old filing cabinet again. He pulled out a faded invoice from 5 years ago. Precision land surveys. He remembered the man who had come to his property then. Careful, methodical. He had used equipment that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Tripods, lasers, receivers. David dialed the number. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was his Hail Mary. If the surveyor couldn't help, the legal fees would bankrupt him before he even started. The phone rang 3 times. A voice answered, professional and awake. David explained the situation. He spoke about the HOA, the new stakes, the threat of fines. He mentioned the adverse possession claim. There was a silence on the other end. Then, a low chuckle. The surveyor remembered. He remembered the property. He remembered the oak tree. Those coordinates weren't guessed, David, the surveyor said. His voice was steady, grounding. We used high-precision GPS technology, sub-centimeter accuracy. There was no dispute then. There shouldn't be one now. Property lines don't move unless someone moves the paperwork. David felt a surge of energy he hadn't felt in days. The HOA says the line moved. They have a new map. They say she maintained the land for 2 years. Maps can be redrawn, the surveyor replied, his tone hardening. But the ground doesn't change. If someone submitted altered documents to the county recorder to match a fake map, that's not a boundary dispute. That's criminal. That's fraud. The word hung in the air. Criminal. Fraud. David looked at the survey on the table. The lines were black ink on white paper, but they represented reality. They represented the earth beneath his feet. Mrs. Patterson hadn't just moved a fence. She had manipulated the system. She had banked on David accepting the HOA's authority without question. She had banked on him being too afraid to verify the science. She thought he would fold under the pressure of fines, but David had verified it. He wasn't just a homeowner fighting a fine anymore. He was a victim of property fraud. The shift in perspective was absolute. The fear evaporated. In its place was a cold, calculated focus. He thanked the surveyor and hung up. He looked at the phone, then at the survey. He didn't need a lawyer to tell him he was right. He needed a surveyor to prove everyone else was wrong. This wasn't about negotiation. You don't negotiate with fraud. You expose it. David stood up. He knew what he had to do next. He had to bring the science back to the soil. He had to make the earth speak for itself. The battle had changed. It was no longer about offense. It was about truth. And for the first time since the orange tape appeared, David knew he was going to win. He looked out the window at the oak tree. It stood silent, waiting. It knew where the line was. And now, so did David. The phone call was over, but the real work was just beginning. He wasn't defending anymore. He was hunting. The envelope sat on the kitchen table. White, heavy, official letterhead. It smelled of ink and authority. David stared at it, his hands hovering over the paper. For days, he had been living in a nightmare of uncertainty. His property, his rights, his history all questioned by people who held the keys to the community. But now, the truth was inside this single sheet of paper. The surveyor stood nearby, packing up his gear. He didn't need to say anything. His expression said it all. This wasn't a close call. This wasn't a gray area. This was black and white. David opened the envelope. The first page was a cover letter, signed and stamped. The second page was the map. The lines were drawn in precise digital ink, overlaid with the GPS coordinates taken just hours before. David traced the boundary with his finger. It matched his original survey from 15 years ago. Exactly. But then he read the notes section, and the air left the room. It wasn't just that David was right. It was that Mrs. Patterson was wrong. Profoundly wrong. The report stated clearly, the existing fence installed by Mrs. Patterson encroached on David's property by 4 feet. Not the other way around. She hadn't just claimed his land. She had built her own structure on top of it. She was the violator. She was the one breaking the rules. The surveyor pointed to a specific annotation in the margin. Look here, he said. I cross-referenced the documents you gave me with the current filings at the county recorder's office. They don't match. David leaned in. The coordinates on the county's digital map had been shifted. Subtly. Just enough to confuse a homeowner. Just enough to give the whore a reason to act. But not enough to fool a licensed professional with GPS equipment. Someone had altered the plat map. Someone had filed false data with the county. David sat back in his chair. The frustration he had felt for weeks, the anxiety, the sleepless nights, the fear of losing the oak tree began to crystallize into something else. Something colder, sharper. This wasn't a dispute anymore. Disputes happen when neighbors disagree on where a line falls. This was intentional. This was calculated. Someone had changed official government records to steal land. That wasn't civil law. That was criminal. He looked at the report again. Evidence of document fraud. Evidence of false claims. Evidence of HOA board misconduct. He wasn't just holding a survey anymore. He was holding a weapon. For days, he had been playing defense, waiting for their letters, worrying about their fines, trying to prove he belonged in his own home. But now, the board had flipped. He wasn't the accused. He was the whistleblower. The surveyor kept his pen. You have everything you need, he said quietly. This report holds up in any court in the state. David nodded. He didn't feel relief yet. He felt focus. The fear was gone. In its place was a quiet, steady resolve. They had tried to bury him in paperwork. They had tried to intimidate him with fines. But they had made one mistake. They thought he wouldn't check the facts. They thought he wouldn't dig deeper. Now he had the shovel, and he knew exactly where to dig. He wasn't defending his property anymore. He was building a case. And this time, he wouldn't stop until everyone involved answered for what they had done. The pen felt heavier than it ever had before. David sat at his desk. The surveyor's report spread out like a map to victory. But knowledge wasn't enough. He needed action. He needed to make them feel the weight of what they had done. He picked up his checkbook and bought 3 certified mail receipts. The cost was negligible, but the legal weight was immense. Certified mail meant proof of delivery. It meant a trail. It meant there was no ignoring this. He wrote the first letter to the HOA board. His tone wasn't angry. It was clinical. He demanded an immediate reversal of all fines. He demanded a written acknowledgement of the error. He attached a surveyor's report. He told them that continuing to enforce the fines would constitute harassment. The second letter went to the county recorder's office. This wasn't a request. It was a report. He detailed the discrepancies in the plat map. He cited the specific document numbers. He formally reported altered government records. He knew this would trigger a protocol. Once fraud is reported to the county, it cannot be swept under the rug. An investigation becomes mandatory. The third letter was the sharpest. It went to Mrs. Patterson's attorney. David didn't threaten the HOA here. He threatened her. He informed them that he would pursue civil charges for property fraud if the boundary was not restored within 10 days. He outlined the potential damages. He mentioned the legal fees. He made it clear that this would not end with a fence moving. It would. And in court, with her name on the defendant's line, he dropped the envelopes in the mailbox. The metal flag clanged down. The sound echoed in the quiet street. Now, the waiting began. Usually, bureaucracy moved slowly. Gears ground. Papers shuffled. Weeks turned into months. David prepared himself for the long haul. He expected silence. For at least a week, he was wrong again. But this time, the surprise was in his favor. The response came faster than anyone could have predicted. Within 24 hours, the phone began to ring. First, the HOA president. His voice was different now. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a nervous stiffness. He mentioned an emergency meeting. They needed to vote immediately to dismiss the fines. They were scrambling to distance themselves from the mistake. Then, Mrs. Patterson's lawyer called. No more threats. No more adverse possession arguments. He requested a settlement discussion. He wanted to know what it would take to make this go away. He knew that if the county investigation went public, his client's reputation would be ruined. She wasn't just fighting a neighbor anymore. She was fighting the state recorder's office. Finally, the county confirmed receipt of his complaint. They opened a formal investigation into the altered documents. This was the nail in the coffin. Once the county investigates, the HOA is altered. Maps become evidence of a crime, not just a civil dispute. David hung up the phone. The house was quiet, but the air was electric. The momentum had shifted completely. Yesterday, he was the one being fined. Today, they were the ones begging for mercy. He had turned their own bureaucracy against them. He had used their rules, their laws, and their fear of liability to break their grip. The 10-day clock was ticking, but David knew the game was already over. They had tried to bury him in paperwork. Instead, he had buried them in evidence. The letters were sent. The trap was sprung. Now, he just had to watch them walk into it. 2 weeks later, the landscape of the neighborhood had changed completely. The tide had fully turned. The HOA board called an emergency session, and this time, the room felt different. The vote was unanimous. All fines against David were dismissed, erased from the records as if they never existed. The board member who had approved Mrs. Patterson's request faced too much heat. He resigned under pressure, his reputation tainted by the scandal. He couldn't survive the scrutiny of fraud. The county recorder's office moved quickly once the investigation began. They corrected the official plat map, restoring the legal record to match the truth on the ground. The ink was dry on the correction, sealing David's ownership forever. Mrs. Patterson had no choice. Her lawyer advised her to settle before civil charges were filed. She agreed to move her fence back to the correct line, and she had to pay for every inch of the labor. The orange tape was gone. The stakes were removed. The eyesore of conflict vanished from the lawn. David received a written apology from the HOA president, a formal acknowledgement of their failure. It felt good, but it wasn't enough. David didn't stop there. He knew that if he stopped, this could happen to someone else. He filed a complaint with the state licensing board against the surveyor who had signed off on the false documents. That surveyor risked losing his license. He had traded his integrity for a favor, and now he would pay the price. Justice wasn't just about winning back his land. It was about accountability. The oak tree stood safe. The boundary was marked correctly. The war was over. David had proven that standing your ground matters. He hadn't just saved his backyard. He had saved the integrity of the entire community. 6 months had passed since the orange tape came down. The scars on the lawn had healed. The grass was green again. David stood in his backyard, the afternoon sun filtering through the leaves of the massive oak tree. It stood tall, rooted firmly on his property, just where it belonged. New stakes marked the correct boundary, clean and precise. No more confusion, no more threats. The silence of the yard was peaceful, not oppressive. The air smelled of summer, not conflict. His wife walked out onto the patio, holding 2 cups of coffee. She looked at the tree, then at him. She remembered the sleepless nights. She remembered the fear of losing their home. Was it worth it? She asked softly. All the stress, the letters, the meetings, the fear? David took the coffee. He looked at the line where the land ended. He thought about the fines, the lawyer, the fight. It wasn't about the land, he said finally. It was about the principle. He turned to her, his voice steady. When someone steals your property line, they aren't just taking grass. They're testing you. They're testing whether you'll defend what's yours. If you let them take the line, what else will they take? Your rights? Your voice? Your home? Once you surrender, there is no going back. She smiled, understanding. The peace they felt now wasn't just because the fence was back. It was because they hadn't surrendered. They had proven that integrity costs something, but surrender costs everything. David looked directly at the camera, breaking the fourth wall. This story isn't just about me. It's about you. Have you ever had a neighbor or an hoa try to take what's yours? Maybe it wasn't land. Maybe it was your rights, your voice, or your peace. What would you do differently? Would you fight? Or would you fold? Share your story in the comments below. Because sometimes, the only way to keep what you love is to stand your ground. Don't let them move your line. Thank you for listening.